is our Dharma? What is our quest? How's it going, everyone? This is Matt Murphy, the host of Dharma Nights. This week, I'm actually going to repurpose some stuff that I've recorded elsewhere at considerably lower quality, although many of you might not notice or care. And it's about some content relating to the Bhagavad Gita, partially because I may have mentioned elsewhere in this podcast, I actually teach yoga teacher training modules for philosophy of yoga, history of yoga, a lot of the jnana yoga topics, aka kind of like the yoga of intellect. So I've had students who have expressed interest in this material, and I've made some like videos and presentations and things like this elsewhere. But for those who are just kind of subscribed to the podcast, whether they are my students or not, people have expressed interest in this kind of stuff. So I thought I would just give a little bit of a piece of that material that I've made elsewhere. And this particular piece of that puzzle is about some key terms in the Bhagavad Gita that can be kind of confusing or can get lost in translation just a bit. And it's especially helpful for students of like yoga philosophy who want to get to know this better. But it's also, for my money, like very rich and rewarding for just spiritual seekers in general. So hope you enjoy it. Hope you get something out of it, or somewhere in between those two ideas. Thanks. This segment of a summary and reading guide for the Bhagavad Gita is going to cover some story context. Many first-time readers of the Gita will pick this up, begin reading, and have absolutely no clue what's going on. They're very quickly introduced to many names which have no importance to the Gita as a self-contained story per se, and others which do have importance, but piecing it all together as a first-time reader can be a little overwhelming unless you have at least a little bit of context about the story that surrounds the Bhagavad Gita, since the Gita of itself is just one section of a larger story called the Mahabharata. So, what's happening in this story? There are two halves of one royal clan called the Kuru clan, and they're about to go to war over who gets to rule the kingdoms of both Hastinapura and Indraprastha. So this civil war is meant to be a rift in the most powerful ruling dynasty of India at this time in history. And it marks the end of an entire, quote, yuga, which is like an astrological age, and the beginning of the Kali Yuga. There are two sides of this ruling clan who are about to go into a brutal civil war with one another. There are the Pandavas, which are 5 semi-divine brothers who are the protagonists of the story. One of the brothers, Arjuna, who's like the best archer of the world in this story, with the possible exception of his nemesis Karna, who is, unbeknownst to him, also his brother, but sort of a long-lost orphaned brother. But anyway, Arjuna is one of the Pandavas, and he is one of the two main characters in the Gita. Who is the other main character? His teacher and friend, Krishna, who happens to be the avatar of Vishnu, who's the preserver god in the Hindu pantheon, who occasionally takes on human form, what would be called taking on the birth of an avatar. And he does this whenever the world gets into a sort of trouble that Vishnu, taking a human form, can help to unravel or mitigate. And he does this on behalf of the world. So Krishna in this story is Arjuna's spiritual advisor and his friend. And in this story of the Bhagavad Gita, he's actively teaching him in the form of this beautiful lecture, which comprises the bulk of the Bhagavad Gita. So there's the cousins of the Pandavas, and they're called the Kauravas. There's 100 brothers and 1 sister. These are the sons of the blind king Dhritarashtra. Dhritarashtra is the king of Hastinapura, and he's been blind since birth. The Kauravas are corrupt rulers, and they behave in a way to satisfy their own egos and their personal honor above all else. So they don't rule from a spiritual center. They let their egos and their desire for honor and even some of their other worldly desires kind of dominate their behavior rather than acting out of any kind of spiritual center. Many of the Pandavas' beloved mentors, uncles, and so on are on the other side of this civil war. So the Pandavas are going to have to fight them, and they're going to have to fight to kill. And they're honor bound to serve the Kauravas due to oaths or other binding ties of clan honor or whatever. But the point is, even though the Pandavas have these people who they love on the other side of the battle serving their corrupt cousins, they're going to have to go to war with them anyway. So why did this war start? The Pandavas, the 5 brothers, were cheated out of their own kingdom, Indraprastha, in a rigged gambling match 13 years ago. But there's a little backstory even behind this part of the story. So while the cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, were both growing up, at a certain point they were reintroduced to one another and grew up in the palace together in Hastinapura. And there was always kind of a question as to who had the legitimate claim to the throne. So the Pandavas, since they were slightly older, arguably had more of a claim to the kingdom of Hastinapura. And on top of this, they were more spiritually virtuous too, because they grew up around a bunch of yogis and forest mystics. And they came into the royal city already during their childhood, like when they had already spent the first years of their childhood in this spiritual retreat. So at some point, the Pandavas create their own kingdom, Indraprastha, out of this sort of unarable land and also out of huge tracts of forest that they have to burn down and kill all the animals within the forest in order to build this city of their own. So they sidestep this whole problem of who's going to inherit the kingdom of Hastinapura. They sidestep it by creating their own kingdom. And the kingdom that they create, called Indraprastha, is prosperous, and the people there are very happy, and it's filled with wonders. So this is all a huge source of jealousy for their corrupt cousins, the Kauravas. So they have this rigged gambling match where the stakes include the Pandavas' personal freedom, even the freedom of their wife, their entire kingdom. And because the Kauravas have their uncle Shakuni, who's like this expert gambler who can't possibly lose, they have him play in their stead. So the whole game is rigged. But the Pandavas just keep gambling and gambling and gambling. And there's sort of a question as to whether they're doing this because they're honor bound to not back down from a challenge, or whether it's just the one noticeable personal failing of their eldest brother Yudhisthira, who otherwise is like a completely morally faultless character in the story. But in either case, this gambling match is a disaster. And the Pandavas lose everything. And they're cheated out of their own kingdom and even their own freedoms. And it's only because of the intervention of Krishna in the form of a miracle that they're granted any of this back. And they immediately lose yet another gambling match where they have to go into exile into the forest for 13 years. So when they get back from exile after 13 years in the wilderness, where they learn all these spiritual strengths and they grow as people, once they get back, Krishna, on behalf of the Pandavas, goes and tries to negotiate for some of the return of their kingdom, because the Kauravas, against the terms of the gambling match and against their word, have decided that they're not even going to grant back a single village of this kingdom. So when Krishna goes in for peace negotiations, since obviously this is a call to war, the peace negotiations fail disastrously. In fact, the Kauravas, in a have a very ill-conceived attempt at trying to kidnap Krishna, who, due to his own miracles and divine nature, effortlessly thwarts the kidnapping. But that's a whole side story in and of itself. But it's very clear that now war is going to happen. So at face value, this whole war is basically a property dispute between the wealthiest class of these kingdoms. But Krishna, who again is the supreme God, the preserver God of the universe, who's taken an avatar of human form, Krishna insists that it's not just a property dispute, that what's at stake is actually the state of the world's Dharma, which is kind of like the overall state of justice, goodness, purpose, ethics, how karma plays out. So Krishna seems to think that if the Kauravas remain in power and continue governing over the land, that it's going to be a disaster for everyone. So it's a property dispute, but it's also positioned as a moral war, where the stakes are basically Dharma being upheld or Dharma being destroyed. Part of the confusing thing about this story is it begins with a framing device where it's narrated by two characters who don't actually take any action in the story of the Bhagavad Gita. They have actions elsewhere in the Mahabharata, which is the larger story that surrounds the Bhagavad Gita. But in the Gita, these two characters just serve as narrators. Blind King Dhritarashtra, who's the father of the Kauravas, those 100 corrupt princes who the Pandavas have to face in battle, Dhritarashtra is back in his palace, far away from the battlefield, and his servant Sanjaya is narrating the events of the war to him. And how can Sanjaya narrate these events? Because Veda Vyasa, the holy sage, who also happens to be the poet of the story, like the writer of the story, Veda Vyasa gives him the gift of divine vision, where he can see everything that's happening from far away. So he can remotely see the events of the war all the way from the palace. And as it's happening, he's narrating this to the blind king Dhritarashtra. So there's a little bit of an irony here, because Dhritarashtra is not only blind, he also, in a sense, is deaf. He can hear, but he refuses to actually hear or at least listen to the things that Sanjaya is saying. His desire for his own corrupt sons, the Kauravas, to prevail blinds him in a symbolic sense, just as he's blind in a literal sense. So he hears what he wants to hear, and he just ignores whatever he doesn't want to hear. So here, his servant Sanjaya has this perfect ability to narrate what's going on, and in the process, he can also see the truth in the spiritual sense of what's happening. That's part of the gift he's been given. So when he says these things to Dhritarashtra, and when he talks about how Krishna's powerful is incredible, and how the Pandavas are mighty, and how they're behaving justly, and how they're the righteous ones, Dhritarashtra refuses to hear any of it. So neither of these characters play any other action roles in the Bhagavad Gita, but the dialogue that they have as narrators plays a huge thematic part in the text, because it has this dynamic of spiritual ignorance and willful blindness versus seeing and accepting what's imminent and real as it's happening. Welcome to the Bhagavad Gita Summary and Reading Guide. Continued in this particular lesson concerned with the historical details of authorship. So what we intend to answer here is, who wrote the Bhagavad Gita? So first, we can begin with some historical context. It comes from a larger story called the Mahabharata, and this was mentioned in a set of slides elsewhere as well. So the Mahabharata is one of two great Indian epics. So in Greek culture, they have the Iliad, they have the Odyssey. Those are the two surviving great epics stemming from an oral tradition. In India, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana would be the equivalents, except they're both much longer than their Greek counterparts, by a factor of 5 to 10 times the amount of content. So the core story of the Mahabharata originated somewhere between 500 BCE and 200 BCE. And the Gita, as it was expanded later by, a range of 100 BCE to 200 BCE. So there is definitely a later expansion of the Bhagavad Gita after the core story of the Mahabharata had already been sort of congealed into a core story and then expanded in written form, right? Even after that, the Bhagavad Gita was expanded almost as if the intention was to make it its own self-contained episode, even though the story itself very much relies on understanding the greater story of the Mahabharata. So the thought is that the content that came out in the Bhagavad Gita at the time that it did um, is very fitting as a response to other spiritual movements that would have been contemporaneous with it on the Indian subcontinent at that time. So, as Buddhists and Jains were making waves within the spiritual landscape of the Indian subcontinent with very different ways of life, particularly with notions of renunciation and monastic orders, meaning like you could leave society and go be a Buddhist monk or go be a Jain monk. That was the landscape. People were leaving the Vedic fold to go pursue these other alternatives in Buddhism and Jainism. So the Bhagavad Gita is thought to be sort of a response to this in a lot of ways. It's thought by most modern scholars to be a later expansion by several different authors, not just one. So many of the authors out there believe that it's actually sort of the product of a few different authors, not just one, expanding this episode. But whoever compiled it into its plural authorship form did so in a way that, while not linear by any means, like the content does jump around, it is nonetheless cohesive and harmonious and lends itself to consistent explanations and interpretations. But yes, the possibility that there are actually different authors is fairly high. So traditionally, the authorship is attributed to Veda Vyasa, who is the author of the Mahabharata and also one of the characters within the Mahabharata. And I've talked about this in separate slides elsewhere. But Veda Vyasa is also, in a way, not just a proper name, but sort of a title. So many people actually, like modern scholars, will make the conjecture that when the author was listed as Veda Vyasa, that it was more or less someone subsuming their own personal identity and merely saying, I am the compiler. Like this was written by the compiler, in sort of a way that diminishes individual authorship as an important component, which is not an entirely unheard of convention. That's appeared elsewhere in the world as well, particularly with spiritual works. So, but the character Veda Vyasa, the historical personage, the sage, as he appears in these stories as a character, was a rishi, meaning he was like a hermit, a mystic, sage, like a forest yogi, one of great spiritual discipline and renunciation, but who nonetheless would participate in society from time to time when called upon for his, guidance, blessings, etc., etc. But nonetheless, someone who did practice esoteric mysticism and spiritual disciplines in the forest. And the rishi is a recurring character type in the larger story of the Mahabharata, but doesn't necessarily make many appearances within the Bhagavad Gita itself. So one other quirk within the larger Mahabharata story, Veda Vyasa is actually also the literal genetic grandfather of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, the two feuding family of cousins, right, within the larger clan. And there's all kinds of symbolic interpretations people have made of that, and we don't have the space to get into that here, but that's just by way of comparison. That is not a convention that we see, for example, in the Greek epics. Like we don't say, oh, Homer, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, we don't say Homer was in the story actually siring these heroes. It's just not, it's a very unique thing within this particular cultural fold. So, and if we keep that view backed up to the greater Mahabharata story, recognizing that the Bhagavad Gita is a story within that larger story, it's worth remembering that in terms of authorship, there's actually an episode of this story, and it's also retold elsewhere, wherein Veda Vyasa was like his mode of authorship of this poem was actually reciting it out loud in real time, and the god Ganesha broke off one of his own tusks to use as a pen or a stylus and dictated it as Veda Vyasa dictated it. Ganesha wrote it down for him. And there's all kinds of interpretations you can impose upon that, and no shortage of ink has been spilled in that direction. But again, that's beyond the scope of this particular lecture. So again, modern scholarship largely believes Mahabharata authorship to be plural. Same goes for the Bhagavad Gita authorship. There are certainly those who say no, it has one single author. There are certainly those who say yes, it has a single author, and that author is the historical personage Veda Vyasa. Certainly many others say no, it probably has one author, but it's some other uncredited author who continued the pen name Veda Vyasa. And then certainly many other modern scholars say no, it's even the Bhagavad Gita within and of itself is a work of plural authorship, and it was just nonetheless folded under the pen name and credit of Veda Vyasa as the single author. So many reasons are discussed in terms of advancing the theory of plural authorship, and not the least of which is that there are moments in the story where the descriptions and the mode of Sanskrit is used is from an older period of time, like a much cruder version of Sanskrit. And like, just as one example, the courtly customs they describe are from a much older time. And curiously enough, from an older time, even than the way that the customs in the Ramayana courtly customs are described. And the Ramayana is supposed to take place in the earlier age or the earlier yuga. So that's one little quirk. Many of the older customs from different time periods in the societies kind of sit next to each other in an anachronistic way. Sort of like if we were to take a European example, if we described a medieval knight from the, like the Middle Ages, sitting next to a Renaissance scholar at the dinner table, many Europeans would say, that's quite anachronistic. That doesn't make sense. Like Leonardo da Vinci sitting next to like a knight from the Crusades. People from like non-European descent might not be able to make that distinction if they're not as familiar, but that would jump out to us. And in much the same way, people who had familiarity with different periods in Indian history have noted that there's anachronistic customs, moments, settings, etc., sitting side by side, which very strongly points to the idea of plural authorship, and not only plural authorship, but written at different periods of time. So we mentioned that even within the Mahabharata, like the Mahabharata itself is thought to have plural authorship, but even the Gita within itself is often believed to have multiple authors. There are changes in narrative style from time to time that people who have deep enough analysis skills to suss this sort of thing out, they've pointed out, hey, this looks like it stylistically, the way it's written is probably by a different author. And the flow of chapter to chapter can jump around a little bit in terms of themes, even though we might also say, well, no, look, there's like a clear organization here, but just a close enough reading shows that some of the things are mentioned in kind of a nonlinear way to where you could make the argument that it was more of an act of someone harmonizing a bunch of different pieces of authorship to approach like a linear reading, even though it was very clearly, in their opinion, not linear. So sort of like the analogy would be if I'm making a mixtape of a bunch of different songs from different periods in history, like in American pop music, I might try to at least arrange them in such a way where I have like R&B songs back to back, even if they're from a decade or two apart. And then maybe I might flow into a different genre But I would try to make some sort of organic flow, even if it seemed to jump around a little bit in other ways. So hopefully that analogy makes sense to people. But the topics are indeed ultimately harmonized to be intelligible, as if it's one prolonged conversation, which is basically the content of the Gita. It's a prolonged conversation almost entirely between Arjuna and Krishna, even though the topics can jump around quite a bit. But the stylistic pivots, even while harmonized, ultimately still support the idea that there's plural authorship and that it's not just one historical personage named Vedavyasa. So this editorial compiling process is probably also one of the reasons why the text is so enduring and why it's very often pointed to as one of the common denominators of quote-unquote Hinduism, even though there really is no such thing as Hinduism as a singular idea. It's like a very plural thing. It means very different things to very different people over a subcontinental landmass and beyond, right? But when someone takes the trouble to compile something by different authors, but does so in a way where the common threads can be compatible, that can be a very enriching and portable way to treat these ideas, such that many different people can pick up the threads and relate to them and apply them in their own worldviews or their own kind of spiritual systems. And that is indeed what has happened with the Gita. Many spiritual systems of very different traditions in India have included the Gita as one of their most important texts, because it covers so much ground, but does so in a way that combines everything in a way that's sensible. And while it can produce multiple interpretations, it's still nonetheless very cohesive. So those are some details about the authorship. Hopefully that sheds some light. Just to summarize, it is credited with one author who also happens to be a mythological personage. And to further compound the possibilities, the name Vedavyasa of that historical personage, who is also a fictional personage, that name is also, in a different context, a title, sort of like the editor of the book or the compiler of the book.